go live now button now, so 30 seconds.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our presentation. Dr. Young and I are both very excited to join you for this presentation titled Becoming a Sexual Citizen, an Introduction to Sexual Projects. My name is Dr. Julie Bullier, and I am a teacher in Pitt's Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies program, otherwise known as GSWS. She or they pronouns are great for me, and thank you for joining us. We are hoping that this will be a wonderful year for you at Pitt.
Yes. My name is Dr. Seth Young. I am one of the pre-licensed staff clinicians over at the University Counseling Center. Pronouns are he, him, his, and very much just echo a lot of sentiments that Julie had just mentioned. Hopefully this will be a great year for you at Pitt. We're all really excited to have you here, and generally just looking forward to it right now. So I just want to get started with the general content warnings, and just important information for all of you to have as you're taking part in this presentation with us, and information that's important for you to have for the rest of the day. So because we are really dealing with some important and at times pretty heavy subject matters and sensitive subject matters, it's important to understand how you are able to distress for yourself and what you need to do in order to take care of yourself. So if that means that you need to walk away from the computer, take a walk, grab some water, take a lap around wherever you're staying right now. If you notice what's coming up for you and you just want to do some deep pressure on your body, push your feet into the floor, notice things around you, focus on your breathing. All these can be incredibly helpful just to help you regain an important sense of balance. We also want to add that if you do want to speak with someone during the time of this presentation, that you are able to dive into the virtual support space, which is hosted by the University Counseling Center. And so if you can, please make sure that you're able to jot down this meeting ID, 943-5017-3800. That meeting ID on the screen will take you to a virtual support space where you will be able to speak with a university clinician in case you do need to speak with someone right away and just kind of help to process exactly what may be coming up for you. Again, this can be a really heavy subject and really sensitive subject at times, but it's also important to know that we're some of your resources. There are many other resources that you'll learn about throughout your time here at Pitt. And you're not alone in any of these endeavors.
Yeah, I want to second what Dr. Young has noted about taking care of yourself. We are sharing important information and inviting you to engage with some pretty tough topics. There are a lot of topics that can be challenging to discuss, especially in large groups. And I want to acknowledge that there's a real difference between slight or even medium discomfort and what we consider to be an embodied traumatic response. And we really do trust you to know the difference. We are here to help you and support you. So again, if anything comes up, please do use our resources. So please make sure that you have our meeting ID on the screen to access the UCC support space that is available to you. And that availability is throughout the program. So again, there's the code in your screen. It's 943-5017-3800. So let's make space for everyone today, which really just means acknowledging that we are impacted differently by these conversations, and a little bit of compassion for diverse experiences goes a really long way.
Yes.
So too many of our campus community members have experienced sexual violence, and we want to create a campus free of violence, harassment, and all forms of sexual misconduct. We want all members of our community to feel respected and safe on our campus. And we also want you to have exciting and fulfilling relationships, including sexual relationships, if that's something that you're interested in. And to do this successfully, you have to think about what others want, to consider their agency, and to increase your capacity to talk about it. So with these goals in mind, here are some of our objectives today. Reduce sexual misconduct on Pitt's campus. Think about your own sexual citizenship. Start to develop sexual projects. Recognize others' sexual agency, and then learn how to be an upstander. We will get into more definitions and details as we go along, but let's start with sexual citizenship. Sexual citizenship is the acknowledgement of your right to sexual self-determination, or the right to determine what is right for ourselves. But importantly, sexual citizenship also refers to the acknowledgement of that right in others. So central to this is the right to consent, or recognizing our right to consent and the rights of others to consent. This mutual respect is a foundation for all healthy relationships, sexual or not, and it is something that requires education and practice, especially when we consider the diverse messages that exist about sex and sexuality, from really sex-positive representations that take consent seriously and treat sex and sexuality and consensual sex as something that can be very good. And these representations are out there, but there are also negative representations that treat sex suspiciously, training us to see desire as something bad or dangerous. So we can acknowledge objectively negative things about sex, and in fact we must, especially in order to be an effective upstander, to be able to intervene and participate in harm reduction. But sex positivity does not treat sex as inevitably bad or dangerous just because it can be at times. So instead, sex positivity encourages direct conversations about improving sex, and we all have to learn to navigate those questions ethically, and quite often in spaces and communities that do not encourage direct communication about sex.
Okay. So we put up these stats here that you see on the slide, just so you can get a sense of the prevalence of sexual violence and also how much it might disrupt our community, specifically the likelihood and the safety and the livelihood and the safety of everyone on our college campus and beyond. And this is not necessarily something that is just taking place at Pitt. This is also a reality across many college campuses across the nation, or universally speaking. We say this so we can speak frankly about this and speak frankly about some of the challenges that might come up in addressing and being able to understand what a healthy sexuality, what a positive sexuality might be able to look like, and also understanding what it means to be a sexual citizen and an upstander specifically. So as you see, 1 in 3 cisgender women, 1 in 6 cisgender men reported experiences with sexual assault. LGBTQIA and BIPOC plus and BIPOC individuals more likely to experience sexual assault at far greater rates. 30% of trans students reported experiencing sexual violence. 26% of students identifying with a disability reported experiencing sexual violence. 40% of Black students report experiencing sexual harassment. And sexual assault is oftentimes committed by a peer and survivor. And survivors oftentimes know their perpetrators. So once again, that's not necessarily to scare you, but just to highlight the reality of some of these concerns. And even as you're seeing right here on the screen, a lot of these experiences even come and highlight the issues when it comes to sexual experiences across different cultural lines and different diversity-related concerns and identities as well. So in order to understand what it means for us to be healthy in our sexual expression and our sexual identities, we also have to admit exactly what these hurdles are. So this is to point out that this is very much a community issue that we can and that we must continue to shape and challenge together. In doing so, we also want to build a very common language amongst consents, what consent is and also what it isn't. We want to be able to identify consents that goes beyond simply just an implication, something that it isn't, but also something that is oftentimes an agreement, it is permission, it is fluid, in something that we oftentimes try to promote in an enthusiastic and provide in a very enthusiastic way. It's not necessarily that's permanent. It can always be something that is withdrawn at times. Just because someone may not necessarily give you a verbal command of no does not necessarily mean that's an automatic assumption of a yes. And oftentimes not being clear on those lines of communication and those lines of boundaries can oftentimes lead to different negative sexual experiences or even sexual violence and sexual assault. So since consent is all about communication, we have this acronym FRIES here to serve as a nice and easy way of remembering what consent is. So oftentimes it is freely given, reversible, informed, enthusiastic, and specific. That enthusiastic piece and the freely given piece, I think, are two of the biggest elements here. But I don't think any one of these factors should be undermined or ignored. All of these can really go a long way with regards to how you are able to communicate in different sexual experiences willingly, and also how you're able to express yourselves willingly. And so if we are coerced, pressured, manipulated, forced into it, then we're not necessarily giving consent, we're not receiving consent. So the big reason why we're here, sexual projects. What is sex for? So the point of this conversation is to understand what a healthy sexuality is. What does it mean to express ourselves in a healthy and positive way? What does it mean to engage in pretty positive relationships, both with ourselves and also with other people? It's about understanding our boundaries and the contours of who we are as people and who we are as sexual beings. And it's important to understand that this can look differently for everyone. Our sexual projects go beyond just the typical ideas of intercourse as we think about sex, but it also gets into how we understand and feel in our bodies. It also gets into how we explore intimate relationships. It gets into how we're able to communicate intimacy to other people, how we are able to experience relationships differently from our peers, monogamously or polyamorously. It might mean how we experience intimacy with friends and with families, and not necessarily just in relationships. Or it's a matter of understanding exactly what does it mean to desire sex in all the forms that it could take, but not necessarily want to do so in a very romantic way. It could even mean not necessarily engaging in sex or that level of intimacy whatsoever. These projects look completely differently for everyone. And as we understand our own cultural identities, it's also very much important to understand the ways in which it can look. So sex can become a way of just deepening that emotional connection. It can be a way of learning and understanding what pleasure means to us, and even what pleasure might mean to our partners, partner or partners. It might mean becoming an experienced partner in terms of communication, in terms of support, in terms of sexual expression. It could be a means of demonstrating love and affection to other people, or it could just be a nice way of understanding exactly how we're able to relieve stress. And at times this might seem weird or unfamiliar to some people. I know for myself, not necessarily having experiences like this, it took me a while to kind of get a handle on, oh, sex can look diverse across all these ways and for different people. So it's really important that we highlight that there's no one way to experience our sex life. So at Pitt, we are introducing this topic of becoming a sexual citizenship. The citizenship or sexual citizenship denotes the acknowledgement of one's own right to sexual self-determination, and importantly recognizes the equivalent right in others. It's something that we're going to be repeating verbatim like that and in different ways throughout the rest of this presentation. So we encourage you to see that there's no right way of experiencing this, that you're able to come at this in different levels, and there's no one level that makes you a sexual citizen or doesn't make you a sexual citizen. People are sexual citizens when they have the right to say yes and they have the right to say no. They are a sexual citizen when they're understanding exactly how their identity becomes wrapped up in this sense of what does it mean to engage in healthy sexual expression? What does it mean to engage in this community of conversation, frank conversation around sexuality? All of these are incredibly important. And so we need to understand, for example, that my sense of sexuality and how I express myself as a sexual being, as a sexual citizen, might be very different from Julie's. Yours might be very different than your peers. It might be different than other family members that you might have. And this might change throughout your life. This is not a static thing. How we understand ourselves can continue to evolve. And it's also really important and incredibly important to remember that. And so when you engage with these topics, you engage where you are. And sometimes it just means starting with curiosity, starting with compassion, and starting with a certain level of openness. And so before we move on, I do want to introduce some stories from other students, which we'll show on the screen, about their own sexual projects and also generally what it could look like.
When I first came to campus as a freshman, I explored a little bit. I was on Tinder, I was on all the dating apps, and there's nothing wrong with it. But I learned that it wasn't for me, and it took me a while to get there. When I first came to campus as a freshman, I explored a little bit. I was on Tinder, I was on all the dating apps, and there's nothing wrong with it. But I learned that it wasn't for me, and it took me a while to get there. I wish someone had helped me through that process a little bit in learning to respect my own wants and my own needs and learning to express them through open communication. And so now I really want to help others find their voice when discussing their sexuality. You know, I think drawing boundaries is so difficult because they are so fluid. They change, and they change as we change. You know, what I thought was appropriate first date behavior when I was a freshman in college is very different than what I think is appropriate first date behavior now. And that comes with a new understanding of my wants and my needs, as well as what my energy can't handle, you know? And so you need to recognize your limits. You need to recognize what drains you, what takes away from you, but you also need to recognize what builds you up and everything, and kind of combine the two of them. There are so many clubs at Pitt that have to do with healthy sexuality. Safe Peer Educators is just one of them. There's also the Planned Parenthood Club, who I know they do a lot of talk not only about bodily autonomy in the form of abortion rights, but as well as bodily autonomy in the form of sexual assault, sexual harassment, anything like that. And there's also a student club called Sex, which discusses very taboo topics that I think really should be brought to the forefront, because how else are we going to learn about it from the internet now?
Okay. So first of all, thank you for managing us through those technical difficulties. It's the Zoom world. We got to understand those challenges. It comes up for all of us. So with that said, let's jump into power, identity, and sexual citizenship. Some of the juiciest bits of what we are talking about for this entire time. This is something that impacts all of us, I think, in different ways. And it's important as we talk about our sense of sexual citizenship that we also understand how our identities begin to intersect, and how that changes and sometimes informs and shapes exactly how we're able to understand ourselves as sexual beings, and also understand and interact with other people as sexual beings, and also the level of sexual expression is very important in regards to what it means to be an upstander. When it comes to power and when it comes to privilege, some of us may have more flexibility than others, and how much power we're able to wield and how much privilege we're able to wield might dictate how we're able to express ourselves, and also in turn how other people may not be able to. So consider sometimes in high school, consider sometimes outside of high school, just in your community. Think about the people who had power or who looked like they had a lot of power. What did it look like? How are they able to express themselves? How do they communicate to other people? What sort of privileges that they have? And think about, if you identify with that, how you were able to navigate those spaces, or if you don't identify with that, how you felt like you were not able to. In that sense, consider people who don't necessarily feel as though they had a lot of power, who don't feel like they had a level of access or a level of privilege. What does that look like? Understanding the intersecting of all those identities in the sense of the level of control and agency and power that we have is very important to understanding ourselves in a curious way, and also empathizing with other people and understanding where they are in their own sexual projects. So in order to make sure that these spaces are open and safe to explore for everyone, we also have to consider this big level in terms of what we consider intersectionality. So this is a term that was coined by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, and basically looks at the interconnectedness of different identity factors. So if you look on the screen, we have race, we have SES, disability, sexuality and gender identity, ethnicity and culture, and religion. And there are more in between and beyond this. It's important to consider all the ways in which, for example, my race and my class and my gender identity and sexual expression might provide me and afford me a certain level of power and expression as a Black man who is upper middle class, who has a PhD, who has a lot of access to things. The ways in which I'm able to express myself as a sexual person might be different than someone who doesn't have a lot of those privileges and a lot of those benefits. It's important to understand how the interconnectedness of identities can create certain systems of power and privilege, and the lack thereof of people who might have more marginalized identities as well. And so when these intersections are highlighted, it's important for us to consider, okay, this is the position that I'm coming from. This is who I am as a person. This is how I'm able to experience the world, but also understanding and empathizing with the fact that some people may not necessarily have the same level of privilege and power that you do. So in terms of our sexual citizenship, it can be a matter of who expresses desire for sex, and what does it mean for them? My sense as a cisgender man, a heterosexual cisgender man, I'm able to express my sexuality, I'm able to express my desire for sex in a way that feels a bit more liberated, in a way that feels as though there are not a lot of negative criticisms, if any, that befall me if I'm expressing my desire, my attraction to someone else. Now, if I intersect and bring my race into this, now that kind of changes things, because people might see me and deem me as a hypersexual person, as a bestial person, as a viral person, a Black man who was always craving sex as a means of power. And that could also oppress and depress my ability to express myself depending on what settings I'm in. Considering these things is also how we can understand how we can connect to other people, and also understand what does sexual expression mean for us and how that might dictate our own experiences with ourselves. Let's jump into power and privilege. So issues of power and privilege are always incredibly important with understanding exactly how we are able to engage with other people. So rigid gender and sexual practices and beliefs about sex and consent can oftentimes contribute to sexual violence. What is sex, what isn't sex, can oftentimes lead to us unintentionally or even maliciously crossing someone's boundaries, objectifying sexual practices, both what might be passive in terms of how we're thinking about these things, or also how we are actively engaging other people, might lead to, once again, crossing someone's boundaries, violating their own right to bodily autonomy and sexual autonomy. Sexual objectification, discrimination against marginalized groups, how we see people of different body types or different people, people of color, different body types, and how we might label them as sexual people without even knowing them, can also lead to instances of problematic sexual behavior, negative interpretations as to what counts as sex, who has access to sex, who should have access to sex. All these things can lead to disruptive ways of being in the world and being sexual citizens. And the big thing is ignoring and dismissing consent. Believing that the lack of a no is an automatic yes. Understanding that just because someone might give us a tentative yes or non-enthusiastic yes, we think that we are free to go. It's that lack of communication, that lack of clarity that can once again lead to some really problematic strategies and interactions with others.
So our next slide is looking at questions of gender norms. This is pretty deeply tied to some of the stuff that Seth was talking about, obviously with respect to power and privilege, and still very much relates to the question of intersectionality. But yeah, so this presentation does include a brief discussion of gender, because gender, and especially social and cultural ideas about gender, impact sexuality. Gender norms are normative expectations that are often quite sexist, limiting us in various ways, but also in other cases, giving people privilege and power, especially to folks who are doing gender in what is considered a socially normal way. We all live with gendered expectations, and we all participate in them in one way or another. So gender norms are often quite different from the statistically normal. I think that's a really important thing to note. In many cases, they actually exist as ideals. So cultural ideals instead of practical or useful scripts, things that none of us actually really measure up to in any kind of significant way. So gender norms, it's wise to keep in mind that these norms and ideals are not always or even often shared in a top-down way, which is to say there's really no central authority on gender. Our everyday actions and behaviors produce and challenge norms of gender. And this is why we are here today, to explore how we participate in ideas about sex, gender, sexuality, and to provide some resources and inspiration for learning about stereotypes and norms, and especially those that can cause harm to others. So here are some effects of gender norms. So gender norms, they can regulate and control who has sex. This can limit who feels like they have a right to speak about sex, but it also creates a lot of double standards for people, like different standards for men, women, or non-binary people, or assumptions about people with disabilities who are frequently excluded from sexual conversations. And as Seth noted about intersectionality, there are a lot of other factors like race, class, and age that are going to impact this understanding of who has sex. Gender norms also determine what is considered acceptable. So in terms of what's considered acceptable, we have spent a lot of time worrying about things like gay versus straight experiences, or partnered versus unpartnered experiences. And really a lot less attention has been given to consent, right? Which is really, if we're thinking about what constitutes acceptable sex, that really has to be central to the conversation. So when we think about that question, right, and the acceptable versus the unacceptable, right, non-consensual sex is, most central in terms of understanding the unacceptable, when considering what we should define as unacceptable sex. But again, we spend a lot more time regulating other things like who does what during sex and what we should or should not enjoy as individuals. And all of that is deeply gendered, right? And so we're wasting a lot of energy on those ideas, right? Instead of looking at the things that would truly impact harm reduction. So another thing that gender is really central to regulating is what qualifies as sex and what doesn't. We have a pretty terribly limited imagination with respect to this, considering that heterosexual penetrative sex is frequently the only thing that counts as sex. So, sex includes a lot of things, and these narrow definitions have implications. So, for example, by this definition, non-heterosexual people cannot have sex at all, and heterosexual people might be coerced into kinds of sexual contact that are not really ideal for them, especially if they believe that real sex equals penetrative sex. Another thing, who experiences pleasure, who has a right to pleasure. We have a really long history of belief that suggests that some people like sex more than others. And in terms of gender, this is really one of the structuring factors of that. But lots of other forms of human diversity impacts this too. So again, thinking about intersectionality, there are assumptions about race, ethnicity, age, physical ability. All of these things structure these presumptions about what kinds of sex people have and their relative interest in it. So in some cases, such assumptions exclude people, and in other circumstances, these assumptions can create fictions about people and presumptions that can, try to socially justify their regulation and also like a more deepened surveillance, right, of specific people and populations. And all of this, right, reproduces logics of sexism and racism, among other things, that are really grounded in these sexual fictions. So sex categorization and power. Sex categorization refers to the process of categorizing bodies based on the various factors that define biological sex. We know that sex is in the body, but categorization can be a very social process. One impact of this is that much of our thinking about sex category falsely assumes that all bodies are easily assigned to one of two sex categories, male or female, even when sex asymmetries are present. So this is often referred to as intersex, when one of any sex criteria in an individual does not align with the other criteria. So, but because sex assignment gives us a legal sex, and because what counts as legal sex is contested, we cannot talk about sex categorization without discussing both power and privilege. So one key example in the US, our laws vary state by state with respect to the requirements for individuals to change their sex on IDs and other documents. And your options are also different in different states. So some allow only 2 options for sex, M or F, and others have several, including non-binary or X. In terms of legal sex categorization and its impact, transgender and intersex people can be deeply impacted, especially if their gender identity and or expression is different from their legal sex. We know that trans and gender nonconforming people are impacted by social expectations about gender identity and gender expression. And to clarify, gender refers to individual and cultural understandings of behaviors, roles, feelings, and activities. Gender is also impacted by historical change. Consider that what it means to be a man or a woman is quite different from generation to generation. But unlike sex category, biological factors do not determine gender. However, our current sex gender system and lots of popular assumptions really do link sex to gender through this naturalization and enforcement of gender conventions and norms. So these norms lead us to believe that there are normal and natural ways of doing gender, determined and limited by our bodies, even when we are aware that gendered characteristics like preferences, tastes, etc., are highly individual and social. So lots of people identify with the sex that they were assigned at birth. This is called cisgender, but most, if not all of us, have experiences that fall outside of the normal expectations of that sex category. This means that all of us are impacted by gendered expectations, and many of us have experiences or have experienced the consequences of these expectations, big or small. So even people that do not identify with gender identity and experience, so agender people, live in a gendered world. And so we are all impacted, but how we are impacted depends on power and privilege. Consider that in some cases for cisgender people, it can be really positive to challenge gender norms, especially when those expectations are based in sexism. So think of what happens to men who parent in public, an everyday thing that people sometimes reward men for. So it is important to note that gender identity and gender expression are different. Some people's gender identities and gender expression match, some people's don't, and both experiences are equally valid. In short, really to sum up that longer statement, recognizing sex and gender as discrete categories allows us to affirm all genders irrespective of assigned sex. So here are a few things to know. Gender does not refer to sex category, and gender is not the natural result of sex. You can always ask people their pronouns and share your pronouns. It's a wonderful practice. And you do not need to know every new category of gender to accept and understand that the existing categories are not enough for all of us. And in fact, you might even learn a bit about your own experiences by considering some of these new categories. Now, sexuality encompasses both romantic and physical desires and attractions. it's really important to note that no one has to participate in sexual activity to know how they self-identify. Heterosexual privilege means that heterosexually identified people do not have to have sex to claim this identity, while others might be judged for this or dismissed, right? So if you are not having sex with people, but you're identifying as anything but heterosexual, in many cases, people will judge you for this. But this is especially the case for bisexual people who are frequently held to fairly absurd standards in order to claim their bisexual identity. People expect them to always be in a sexual or romantic relationship with more than one gender, right? So sexual practice can be completely unrelated to your sexual identity. Some sexual identities specify romantic and or sexual object choice. Those are the ones that we're most familiar with, right? They say like what gender you are and what is the gender of the people you are attracted to. That's heterosexual, homosexual, gay, lesbian, those sorts of things. While others express romantic and or sexual desires or acts as they relate to more dominant or common understandings of sex. So for example, queer, which we hear a lot, refers to romantic and or sexual identities or acts that differ from existing norms, right? Pansexual expresses romantic and or sexual desires that are not influenced or determined by sex or gender. Asexual defines people with neutral or non-existent sexual desires and or attractions. Some of you, again, may have noticed that we have added a lot of different names for sexual experiences in the last decade or so. We've always been doing this, just so you know, but if you feel overwhelmed by these new terms, again, just keep in mind that you don't really need to understand all of the intricacies of someone's identity to understand that they are deserving of respect, and that, again, our existing categories really do not capture the full complexity of all of our experiences. Now, theory, there's a lot of people who like to study gender theory. I'm one of those people. And theory is pretty critical, right? Because theory governs practice. What we think about it, how we conceptualize things, those are the things that ultimately end up governing the practice of our, institutions. So institutional and non-discrimination policies, they protect individuals from discrimination or harassment based on things like sexual orientation, gender identity, or expression. Feminist and queer theories promote safe and consensual sex, as well as harm reduction. So sexual identity, and gender expression have definitely found their way into institutional diversity commitments really out of necessity, because people had been being treated differently, right, for these things. And so we needed to have protected categories. But in addition to advocating for people who face discrimination due to sex, gender, and sexuality, feminist and queer theories promote safe and consensual sex, as well as harm reduction. And they do this by focusing on decreasing stigma while increasing attention to public safety and public health. The argument is, of course, that decreased stigma, which permits more open sex education, benefits public health. It is true that part of the work of feminist and queer scholarship is to challenge accepted norms, especially when sex, gender, or sexuality become central factors in what we are allowed to do, who we are allowed to be, and more broadly, how we are valued as individuals. Theory and practice, or theory and policy, are deeply related, since our ideas about sex, gender, and sexuality structure our policies. One example that is familiar to a lot of people who experience sex education in the US is that if sex is thought of or theorized, right, as an exclusively negative thing, then you are less likely to get a comprehensive sex education.
Okay. So we're throwing a lot of information at you and we're explaining a lot of these things at you. But the big question is, where do we even begin with something like this? Because again, we were emphasizing and highlighting the seriousness of something like this, and also introducing these new ideas, and also introducing some challenging things that can be difficult for all of us who are engaging in this and oftentimes want to be as empathetic and as curious and as honest and true and authentic as possible. So in terms of developing our sexual projects, let's look at it this way. We all have our projects. Our projects are always ongoing and always developing. You can think about this more so in terms of how we've had academic projects in the past, different type of family projects in the present, career projects in the future, even currently. These things that are always shifting and changing, and things that we are a lot more comfortable talking about because it feels a bit more socially acceptable. We don't have a lot of these sort of frank conversations about sexual projects in terms of sexual expression, in terms of the different, the multifaceted nature of sexual identity, and what does it mean to have sex. And if we do, we oftentimes have it in the academic sphere, or I think more so with regards to like a clinical sphere, or in these really isolated levels. We don't necessarily have it in the deeper setting that we kind of want you to be able to have it right now. But it is important to know and to reiterate that we're always engaging in developing sexual projects. For me personally, the way this is looking is understanding the ways in which other people of different sexual identities and different genders are able to just experience themselves as sexual people in ways that I didn't understand or might have had blind spots to. It helps me to understand the things I may have internalized, but also helps me understand the ways in which I can also express myself as a person who desires sex, as a person who sees myself in a sexual light, who's trying to understand my body a bit more in terms of who I am as a person of color. For other people, this might start with a conversation, again, of intimacy, of curiosity, of wondering what sex could or couldn't look like in their own lives, what qualifies and what doesn't qualify as sex in their own lives. If someone is asexual, or they might think that they do not have a sexual project. You in fact absolutely do have a sexual project. You 100% do. It's important to understand exactly what that might mean for you and how that might appear. For people who are aromantic, same thing applies. It's important to understand exactly how the sexual project appears to you. There's no correct way of doing so, or a better way of putting it is that every way is a correct way of doing so. And so as you begin to define how these elements look for you, I think you'll have a bit more time to explore this as we dive into your conversation circles a little later on. Okay, so becoming a sexual citizen. So as such, we need to respect the agency of other people as we're engaging in these conversations with one another, as we are understanding that other people are building their sexual projects, that we're building our own sexual projects. We want to respect the humanity of others. We want to meet them where they are. We want people to meet us where we are. It's about understanding and engaging at that level of like reciprocal empathy and understanding. And so the tips for doing so, especially as you continue to reflect on this yourself and also talk to other people about it, is being respectful of all people, recognizing that other people might have different sexual projects from you. You might be on one sphere, you might be whomever. That's absolutely okay. You do whatever you need to do, and you come at this however you need to come at it. In terms of respecting people's identities, use correct pronouns, understand exactly how they identify. Don't shirk that, don't dismiss that, don't undermine that. It's a matter of respecting who they are as a person, and even using correct pronouns can go a very long way to respecting someone's identity as a person. And once again, recognizing that we all come from different experiences. So the next stories that we are about to introduce dive in a bit more of what we are talking about, and they will help you to get a sense of how these projects can look like and how they can appear for different students. So let's play the clip.
I was always taught that sex was something dirty, that it was shameful, that we didn't talk about it. It was not something to discuss ever. If it happened, it happened. We don't talk about it.
My school in suburban Cleveland, Ohio, had an abstinence-only sex education. It was also only centered on heterosexual sex. There was no discussion of queer sexuality, of sexual safety and health for queer communities, let alone for anybody.
And if you have sex, you'll get an STD and also pregnant, and then you'll die.
Even though like there were steps to try to make it more inclusive, I feel like definitely a lot of social perceptions of what sexual education like was and how you could talk about it from the students really limited my perspective.
If you come from a background, an area, a school where you don't experience much queerness, you don't see much queerness around you, you don't know many queer people, be ready for that to change.
I would say that the culture of consent on Pitt's campus is well-intentioned.
It definitely needs to be better.
If I were able to, build a different kind of environment around sex and sexuality on Pitt's campus, I would really emphasize the importance of enthusiastic consent and continual consent. Just because someone says that they want to engage in an action because you've been on a date with them and you've been, making out or whatever, and you want to take another step and you ask for consent, there's a good chance that that person doesn't feel like they can say no. And so I think that there's often experiences where it's not non-consensual, but it's definitely not enthusiastic consent. So understanding that, even in one experience with someone, it's not blanket consent for whatever you want to do. It is a two-way partnership that requires ongoing conversations, ongoing giving of consent, ongoing checking in between both partners.
I think that a lot of the times people don't necessarily understand what consent is. I understand consent to be an enthusiastic, clear yes.
Language is important, but at the end of the day, people's consent is being violated at extremely high rates. And it bothers me that these types of conversations that happen on a huge level sometimes are not taken seriously by a lot of students.
I think the most difficult part of creating a healthier campus culture is that it's founded on having deeply uncomfortable conversations. Discomfort and negative feelings are something that gets a bad rap. Understandably so. It's not fun to be uncomfortable, and it's not fun to have to reevaluate parts of your life and go, oh, maybe that wasn't what I thought it was.
I think especially as a lot of us are learning and maturing and out of the house, living on our own for the first time, that there's really a lot of pressure to conform to whatever's happening around you, to latch onto whatever language is being used, to embrace whatever attitude the people around you have about sex and sexuality. And again, because of wider social and cultural norms about how we talk about sex and sexuality and our bodies and who we love and how we love them, that we really don't talk about how to communicate with other people about sex and sexuality in a way that is not demeaning, in a way that is not heteronormative, in a way that is not misogynistic. Those things are just really not part of our vocabulary and part of our regular ways of communicating. So I think any opportunity to not only give people the words and the phrases to talk about their negative experiences, but the opportunity to talk about their positive experiences is really important. I think would foster a different kind of relationship on campus and kind of help people understand the situation they're in, if they're happy or not. I mean, it's hard to understand if you're happy, if you're being treated right, if you have nothing to compare it against. So having respectful language to be able to effectively have those conversations, I think would be really helpful.
Not everybody gets it right the first time. I didn't get it right the first time. And I think acknowledging that growth is a process and growth takes time, and having patience with yourself, honestly, to really embark on this and being willing to get it wrong, but also being willing to take new information and inform newer and better opinions about it.
I think talking to your friends about healthy sexuality and relationships really comes from being at a place where you're comfortable sharing and being the first person, potentially. A lot of times, if you're open about an experience, people will feel more comfortable opening up to you.
Those little voices in the back of your head when you're seeing something go down, you're like, maybe I shouldn't say anything. Maybe someone will get mad at me. Maybe it'll be taken the wrong way. It doesn't look bad to care about other people. And we really need to foster a community where we all got each other's back.
And you don't always know exactly what to do, but saying something is always better than saying nothing.
There's so many different ways that we can contribute to a more positive culture and a more open culture when talking about consent, and hopefully in the long run the culture of consent will definitely be improved on Pitt's campus.
One of the things I wish someone had explained to me is the difference between attraction and desire to engage in physical activity with somebody. There's an assumption of if you find someone attractive and you talk with them, then there's an assumption that you're physical and intimate with them, and then there's an assumption that you'll engage in some sort of sexual activity with them. That is not the way that it has to go, and I don't think anyone ever made it clear to me that you can be attracted to someone without a desire to be with them, that you can be interested in being with someone without them being the most attractive, and if you like different kinds of people. And I think that that's just something that we kind of push aside, and we ignore attraction and desire, and I think we think of them as frivolous, but they're not frivolous. They are something that add richness and depth to your life, and you can use them sparingly, you can use them, spread it wide, that's up to you, but you don't necessarily have to follow any kind of linear path in deciding who you like, what you want to do, and who you want to spend your time with.
So this is a call to action. It's a short program, but we are here presenting this to you to inspire you to make a difference. Hopefully these student voices are helping with that and helping to inspire you in that way. Now, action takes many forms, and education is an important first step. So focusing on your personal sexual projects helps us to develop our own awareness about what we do and do not want with respect to sex and sexual intimacy. Many people think that desire is a natural process, and desire is in the body, and it feels like an instinct to many. And desire is in fact discussed in many ways as a primal instinct in many ways, or in many cases. But developing awareness about our own interests is central because we all live with a lot of messaging about sex. So discovering what we want, it's a process, especially when we are told what we should and shouldn't do from a very young age. So the self-awareness must also inspire an awareness of others, an awareness that other people might be in process, still figuring things out for themselves. But this can also be a lifelong process. I think it is for many people, especially since our sexual interests and capacities can change over time. So if you accept that others are in process, working on their sexual projects, figuring it out, that awareness should impact your behavior, resulting in more communication, and as a result, a more diverse awareness of sexual intimacy. So all of this work is also what inspires us to be upstanders, people who are willing to intervene when they witness things that are violating someone else's rights and desires. So we can all be upstanders. Education is a great resource for being an upstander, but there's no special type of person who can take on this important role. We should all be upstanders. At nearly 43 and as a member of Pitt's teaching faculty, I might be a more experienced upstander, but trust me when I say that I still need people to step up for me. Very recently, in fact, a male friend stood up for me in a situation where my safety was in question. It's entirely possible that I could have handled it myself, but there's also a form of validation and acknowledgement that happens when someone else steps in and affirms that you deserve something different. So we've discussed some issues of identity and privilege through theories of intersectionality. So it's also useful to mention that our identities can impact our capacity to intervene, as well as how effective that intervention is. So in my case, after intervening, my friend checked in to see if that was okay, showing his awareness of how it might feel awkward to stand up for someone. And in that case, he really was concerned that he was speaking for me in a way that might have been too presumptive or sexist, especially if I thought he was presuming that I couldn't manage it myself. But of course, we shouldn't be surprised to learn that some people's voices have more power and authority in specific situations. I was really deeply impacted, not only by the intervention, but also about the follow-up. Was that okay? The way I intervened. It's very powerful for me. So big or small, intervening is very powerful, not just in the sense of preventing a negative outcome. That's first and foremost why we're doing it, but we take that intervention with us, right? It tells us that we deserved that intervention. So as upstanders, we participate in sexual citizenship, which means that we are actively participating in understanding things like sexual difference, consent, healthy communication, and intervention.
Okay, so let's talk about some general strategies here. At this point, a lot of this is going to be redundant because we've rolled it into this presentation. You've seen in the videos, and Julie's also mentioned some on their end. But there are different ways of intervening in these situations, big or small. And one of the most effective ways is determining your level of comfort with the strategy that you choose. Being true to yourself, being honest to yourself, and feeling out which strategy, which tactic is the best way for you to intervene and to speak up for someone can really go a long way to helping to assuage and mitigate any sort of anxiety that you're having, and also to validate the general experience of someone else. So on one end, you can do a direct intervention. You can, if you see problematic behavior, directly addressing it. I personally like to use humor whenever I directly confront something. It makes it a little bit easier for me to segue into it, but it's also a form of direct intervention. Another way you could distract it, find a way to immediately change the situation, flipping the light on, if you are at a party, asking who wants to get food, pulling someone out of that scenario pretty directly. Those can be ways of both like distracting and even in a way of mitigating it in a pretty direct way. You can delegate, call for help, check in with someone, recruit more people, recruit more allies who can help you to navigate that situation if you want to intervene on someone else's behalf. If you aren't sure of what you saw or what you heard, talk to a friend together, get that perspective, get that important feedback to kind of help balance your own thoughts and your own perspectives, kind of help calibrate your own internal compass. So even again in the future, you have a better sense of how to engage, and also again to help mitigate some of that worry and some of that anxiety. And then document this. And this doesn't necessarily have to be anything formal, even though it could. Through your time here at Pitt, you will understand that there are many resources that you are able to use both through the University of Pittsburgh and even outside if you do want to document something officially. But even just being able to follow up, take notes, make a note of what it is that you saw and what you witnessed, following up with someone who's been a survivor of this type of violence, of this type of misconduct, so you can just show your support to them. These are all important ways of just trying to be an ally. We always want you to be an ally. We always want you to check in with someone. We always want to make sure that as an upstander and as a sexual citizen, you're trying to empathize and give off your genuine self. And some barriers to being an upstander. Again, a lot of things that we've already mentioned so far. So at times you might be concerned that you're misreading a situation and that you might be embarrassed. There's no wrong way to intervene, and oftentimes it's better to kind of make that quote unquote error than to let that go unnoticed or uninterrupted. Truth of the matter that these concerns are incredibly real, and at times we feel as though someone else might be more effective than what we are. We don't have the right way of addressing it. Fact of the matter is that that's not true. We have the incredible agency in order to do so. But also, as Julie mentioned, the power dynamics in the situation and the fear of retaliation can be things that stop us from effectively intervening. And so sometimes being able to recruit people to help us to mitigate some of that stress, to use their power and use their privilege to make an active change and a healthy change can definitely go a long way. So again, we can understand why this might be kind of nerve-wracking at times, and sometimes very nerve-wracking for me, but it's also important to understand that, yes, I might have a lot more power and privilege than someone else might have in that situation in order to step in order to defend someone.
I want to thank everybody for being here. We're just about to send you off into the next part of the program. And so your next steps are these conversation circles. So we have some instructions for this. At the end of last week, you should have received an email from your resident director or from the Office for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion about this program. That email included a registration link that you will need to join the next part of our program. So once we end this program, not yet, you will be joining your conversation circle. So this is a code for tech support. So if you need assistance logging into your conversation circle, please go to Microsoft Teams and click join or create a team below your teams list and look for the join a team with code card and enter the code you see on the screen. So again, just go to Microsoft Teams, click join or create a team, and then below your teams list, you'll look for the join a team with code, and then you'll enter this code here. So the code is 4Z9W67H. I really do want to thank everyone for being here again. Special thanks to everybody who worked on the program, and what a delight to present with you, Seth.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Julie. I think this was great. This was fun. Again, we are once again excited to have you here at Pitt. And just a reminder, all of you, depending on which donor you're on, depending on which group you're part of, may have gotten your own specific registration links for the conversation circle. So just make sure that you're joining those, and then we'll be off from there. All right. And so see you for the next step in the Sexual Citizenship Project. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, and just one last little thing, if you can't find your teams, you're logging into your teams through your mypitt.edu. You'll be going there a lot in your time here at Pitt, but that's where you're going for your teams information.
Yes.
Thanks,
All right,
everyone.
sounds good. Thank you, everyone.